Vanakkam. On behalf of Pearl, I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today to discuss justice and peace in Sri Lanka, possibilities and risks. And special thanks to Sibley Austin for hosting today's panel and reception. First, I'd like to start by just giving a quick recap on Sri Lanka's conflict. Sri Lanka's ethnic conflict began with decades of discriminatory policies and ethnic pogroms against Tamils immediately after independence in the late 1940s. Open war began in the 1980s between the Sri Lankan military and the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, known as the LTTE. The war peaked with a brutal military campaign in 2008 to 2009, in which tens of thousands of Tamil civilians were killed through shelling, artillery, and starvation. A report from the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights last year concluded that war crimes and crimes against humanity occurred, and noted violations of international law committed by both the government and the LTTE. In October, the Sri Lankan government co-sponsored a resolution at the UN Human Rights Council, which laid out a plan for accountability for these mass atrocities, notably including the involvement of international judges and prosecutors in an accountability mechanism. However, Sri Lanka's implementation of these laudable commitments has been lagging, if not entirely non-existent, and senior Sri Lankan officials, including the president, have explicitly backtracked from these commitments in public statements. Looking more recently, just last week, both the UN Special Rapporteur on the Independence of Lawyers and Judges, Monica Pinto, and the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan Mendez, concluded contemporaneous visits to Sri Lanka. In a UN media advisory issued yesterday, both special rapporteurs jointly urged Sri Lanka to adopt urgent measures to fight torture and strengthen the independence of the justice system. The special rapporteurs stressed, quote, "The change in government has led to some promising reforms, but more reforms are needed before Sri Lanka can be considered to be on a path to sustainable democratization." Mr. Mendez concluded that torture is a common practice in Sri Lanka and noted that Sri Lanka's criminal justice system may directly incentivize the use of torture. Mr. Mendez condemned the total impunity that surrounds old and new cases of torture, and also noted that Sri Lanka's conditions of incarceration amount to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment. Ms. Pinto called out Sri Lanka's often criticized Prevention of Terrorism Act, saying it allows for prolonged arbitrary detention without charge and must be repealed. Ms. Pinto also raised concerns that, quote, "the diversity of the population is not reflected in the composition of the judiciary, the Attorney General's office, or the police, or in the language in which proceedings are conducted." Now, to reflect the current positioning of the United States, we might look first to the U.S.-Sri Lanka Trade and Investment Framework Agreement Council, which was held on April 28th, at which the two countries initiated a joint action plan. There, U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, called Sri Lanka a, quote, "global champion of human rights." Just last week, the State Department's Directorate of Defense Trade Controls, or DDTC, announced that it has eased long-standing military trade restrictions on Sri Lanka. Now, in contrast, we've seen a European approach that is more cautious. The EU has placed conditions on Sri Lanka's resumption of the Generalized System of Preferences, GSP+, as concerns persist about Sri Lanka delivering reforms. And we can also look to the High Commissioner for Human Rights and his statement after concluding a visit to Sri Lanka earlier this year that he will report to the UNHRC in June about Sri Lanka's progress or lack thereof in implementing the resolution it co-sponsored last October. We are joined today by a distinguished panel of experts who are going to share their preliminary thoughts, after which we'll have a larger discussion, which will leave time for questions from the attendees at the conclusion. Our speakers today are Cara Bu, a founding partner at Armitage International, Lisa Curtis, Senior Research Fellow on South Asia at the Heritage Foundation, Alan Keenan, Senior Analyst on Sri Lanka at International Crisis Group, and Dr. Sudhaharan Nadaraja, Assistant Professor at the University of London Centre for International Studies and Diplomacy in the School of Oriental and African Studies. I'll just take this opportunity to remind our speakers that we'd like to keep these preliminary remarks to 8 minutes or less so that we have plenty of time to discuss as a group. And I will let you know when you have 1 minute remaining. First, we've asked Sudha Nadaraja to begin our discussion today by giving us the long view on Sri Lanka's liberal reforms and engagement by the international community. Next, Cara Bu will speak about the U.S. government's current engagement on Sri Lanka and her view on how engagement is proceeding. Then Lisa Curtis will discuss the possibilities and opportunities of liberal reforms in Sri Lanka. And finally, Alan will speak about the obstacles and issues the Sri Lankan government must address for meaningful reform to take hold. I'll turn it over to Sudha.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's 8 minutes, and Sri Lanka is a topic, like many places, if you study it long enough, you can go on forever. So I shall try and identify like 2 or 3 things which, in my view, are important to bear in mind when we think about either studying Sri Lanka or implementing progress in Sri Lanka. If you look at Sri Lanka's history over the last 40 years, since the war started, throughout the war and the war ended, it's a kind of a signature of everything that's not good. So ethnic violence, mass atrocities, human rights abuses of all kinds, and so on. And it's been sort of characteristic. People take it for granted. This is what happens in Sri Lanka. This is how we should think about Sri Lanka. So that's one kind of thread. But another thread is that for almost all the time, except for 3 years between 2012 and 2015, Sri Lanka has had excellent relations with liberal states, including the United States. It's a paradox. So if you look at particular moments, so say just after the war started, when we had the Jayawardena administration in Sri Lanka and the Ronald Reagan administration here, there were good relationships. If you look at the post-Cold War era, we had Chandrika Kumaratunga's administration in Colombo, and you had first the Clinton administration and the Bush administration. There were good relationships. And this is, if we take seriously the idea that the U.S. Is the linchpin of a liberal order-making project, there is a paradox. So how can this be explained? Now one explanation, and this is it appears every now and then, is that, well, human rights is just not that important. Like there are big strategic interests or commercial interests or fill in the interest of your predilection. And that's what really matters. And everything else is cosmetic. Now, I say this, even though it might sound a little odd here in Washington, because it's shared by a whole bunch of people. And those are people in the public sector, so the journalists, analysts, and so on, but also in government. So there are sections of the Sri Lankan administration which believe that, well, really it's about something more. This is just cosmetic. And they say so, and they have said so explicitly over time. But another explanation is, and this is the one I'm offering, is that the reason this happens is because there is a kind of an optimism to U.S. engagement with Sri Lanka. It's a persistent optimism. I'm not saying this as a naivety, but it's a way of saying, well, these horrific things might have happened, but today there's a way forward, and there's always a way forward. And if you identify that way forward and we back it, either by backing particular actors or pumping money in or intervening in some other way, it will lead to progress. Now that's true to some extent, but the question is, how do you identify avenues for progress? And my simple argument is that looking for opportunities with a presumption of progress leads to creating the very conditions that hold it up. If you look at the current situation, there's kind of an analysis that simply because Rajapaksa's government has been replaced by someone else, and that someone else is making the right kind of nods, the right kind of noises, progress is almost certainly possible and should be backed. So it's not a question of whether the US should engage or not engage, because the US has always been engaged, as have many other Western states, the UK, where I live as well. The question is how to engage. And it's become the case where simply because people are not as bad as Rajapaksa, they should simply be trusted to follow through on everything else. Now, that's exactly what has happened before. Jayawardena's government was backed by Ronald Reagan's government because they were different to Sri Ma's government before. They were communists, these are capitalists, and so on. And if you find these key moments of change in Sri Lanka, you find the US has been enthusiastically backed the changed. So when we take the long view, this is a recurrent pattern. And my concluding point is that the more things change, the more they stay the same. We are at precisely the same moment again today, and the same kind of calculations are being made. As to if we want progress in Sri Lanka, these are the steps. But these steps have failed before. I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Sudha. Next, we'll hear from Kara.
Thank you very much. Thanks to Pearl for having this event and for including me. I've had the benefit of being able to travel to Sri Lanka quite a bit lately. I leave actually tomorrow night for my 4th visit since September. So I feel very in tune at this moment anyway with what's going on. I've been asked to talk about the U.S. engagement in Sri Lanka, and my involvement in it dates back to 2002 during the peace process when I worked for then Deputy Secretary Armitage as he supported that process with the Norwegian government. Obviously, that didn't turn out well, but as Sudha says, the United States always remains optimistic. I mean, I think it's part of our nature. And so when the elections happened in January, we really were Johnny on the spot in the sense that we were looking at this as an opportunity to broaden our relationship with Sri Lanka, which had been quite stymied during the Rajapaksa era. And evidence of our enthusiasm, I think, first came with all of the visits. We had Secretary Kerry go out, the first Secretary of State to Sri Lanka in 43 years, followed up or either preceded or followed up by Undersecretary Shannon and Assistant Secretary Nisha Biswal, and even a cabinet level person, the UN Ambassador Samantha Power. That was all a signal, I believe, from our government to show our true interest and excitement about prospects for Sri Lanka. No doubt the protocol people in Colombo were overwhelmed, but we were happy to be there. We also saw the arrival of a new ambassador who's proven to be very enthusiastic and active in trying to increase and strengthen the relationship with Sri Lanka. All of that enthusiasm has driven into some very significant initiatives. The first being the U.S. effort, along with the Sri Lankans, at the UN Human Rights Council meeting last fall. We've worked with the Sri Lankan government on economic issues. We saw the Millennium Challenge Organization offer up programs for Sri Lanka. We had the TIFA talks just most recently. We've also established a partnership for dialogue, which is going to be an annual event with something regular and structured dialogue that helps move the U.S.-Sri Lankan bilateral relationship along. We've seen in the last 16, 18 months progress on the Sri Lankan part too. We've seen a drawback of the military, or at least a diminishing of its presence in the north and east. We've seen efforts with the UN Human Rights Council resolution and other efforts on the part of the government on reconciliation and accountability. That said, I mean, while there has been movement, it's clearly insufficient. in terms of the agenda we've set for ourselves and what Sri Lanka has also set for itself. There's a lot left to do, and you more than anyone know how much is left to do. It's a tremendous and very difficult path Sri Lanka is going to have to go in order to make all the people of Sri Lanka feel that they are part of a nation that has their benefits in mind. So that puts a heavy burden on the relationship, and one that's very tricky. To my mind, that given how tricky it is and how much has been put forward in terms of ideas, even if you read the joint action plan coming out of the TIFA, there's very big things that we've all committed to do. So as we all strive for the big things, to include some of the commitments made at the UN Human Rights Council, we can't forget the little stuff, which is actually the big stuff, which is implementation. I traveled throughout the North and East in February, and the mantra I heard everywhere I went was, everything has changed, but yet nothing has changed. That was the sentiment in the North and East. And I think that's what we have to struggle to do, is while we're looking at these very large and involved commitments, and many of which are going to need a long time to flourish, we can't forget that we need to have a peace dividend make itself present to the people in the North and East and to the people in the South. There has to be a recognition throughout the country that this government intends to follow through on its commitments. And so I guess from my view, and I know that the State Department and the embassy have this in mind, but I think really we have to keep a focus on making some concrete and very evident changes that will keep people online as the long-term efforts, such as reconciliation and accountability mechanisms, come in place, that those can come through in a very deliberate fashion, which clearly will not be soon enough for some of the people in Sri Lanka. But if we can focus the government as well on some concrete confidence-building efforts, that too should go a long way, such that people won't be able to say with reason that not everything has changed. And so I think those are my comments so far. I'm happy to answer any questions. But
thank you, Cara. Next, we'll turn to Lisa.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me here today, and thank you all for coming out despite the rain. Yeah, I would just start off. I have a slightly different viewpoint, I think, than Dr. Nataraja, in that I think human rights do matter to the U.S., and that was quite evident in the kind of relationship that we saw between the U.S. and the Rajapaksa government from 2009 to 2015, when military sales were curtailed, the MCC negotiations were curtailed. There were several steps that the U.S. took to indicate that it was unhappy with the direction of things in Sri Lanka, not the human rights concerns, but as well as what was happening to democracy in the country. And so certainly I think we have to acknowledge things have changed in the last 16 months. We could argue about how much or not enough, but I think that, certainly we have to acknowledge there have been some changes. And we've seen a rapid turnaround in the U.S.-Sri Lankan relationship. Cara just talked about it. I would just emphasize, I think the passing of the 19th Amendment just about a year ago was a milestone on Sri Lanka's path back to democracy. And certainly the government's decision to agree to a UN resolution calling for post-war reconciliation and investigation of alleged war crimes was also a very important milestone. And Cara talked about some of the concrete ways that we have seen U.S.-Sri Lankan relations improve, whether it be the partnership dialogue that Cara mentioned, which was held in February, the first ever partnership dialogue, the lifting of the restrictions on military trade, which has just happened, the resumption of talks on an MCC threshold program, which I would add could be helpful in encouraging business development and reviving economic activity in the war-torn areas of the North and East. So I guess the question is, we've seen this clear shift in U.S. policy towards Sri Lanka, and has it been merited by developments on the ground there? And I would argue yes. And I would point to some of the changes that we've seen. I talked about the 19th Amendment, the establishment of independent commissions to oversee the judiciary, police, public services. Cara mentioned the lifting of the travel restrictions in the north. I would also point to the fact that we've seen human rights organizations visiting the country again. Human Rights Watch was there in October, Amnesty International in December. The UN Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances also visited in November, the first time in 16 years that they were able to visit there. The restrictions on media freedom are beginning to be lifted. The government has lifted censorship of dissident websites, and the Defense Ministry is no longer involved in clearing visas for journalists. And on sort of symbolic steps, the government has lifted the prohibition on singing the national anthem in Tamil. And lastly, the government has stated its commitment to adopting a new constitution. And the first parliamentary steering committee meeting on this issue was held in early April. Now, all of that said, obviously not enough has happened, as Cara has pointed out, or not quickly enough. And one of the issues is the inquiry into alleged war crimes, which one could argue the government is dragging its feet on this. There's been this protracted argument about whether there will be international participation in such a panel. A lot of resistance to that from nationalists who still, hold a fair amount of seats in the parliament. So the government certainly has to find a way forward on this, and fairly quickly. Let me talk just a little bit about foreign policy, because this is an important part of the equation in Sri Lanka right now. And we have seen a shift in the foreign policy orientation since the new government has taken over, going back to January 2015. There's more concentration on balancing relations between India and China. And Foreign Minister Samarira, when he was here, referred to this as practical non-alignment. There, of course, had been criticism of the Rajapaksa government for cozying up to China for these large-scale infrastructure projects, and those being tainted by corruption, and the fact that the Rajapaksa regime was relying too heavily on China for investment, for military equipment, and that this was happening at the expense of Sri Lanka's relationship with India. So India is certainly welcoming this change in the Sri Lankan foreign policy orientation. Prime Minister Modi made the first bilateral visit by an Indian prime minister to the country since 1987, which was quite significant. But as we had a program on Sri Lanka at the Heritage Foundation about a year ago, and during that program, I had argued that the initial media reports talking about this change in the foreign policy orientation were probably a bit overstated. And even though the Port City project was suspended, I had said back then, it was virtually unthinkable that it wouldn't be resumed at some point. I saw this Port City project when I was in Sri Lanka about a year ago. It's a massive project. Already a lot of investment has gone into it. So it was sort of inconceivable that it wouldn't be continued at some point. In fact, this is what we've seen in the last few weeks since the Prime Minister Wickremesinghe's visit to China, is that project is being resumed 1 year later. And this should not be surprising. Sri Lanka needs Chinese infrastructure investment. They have $8 billion in debt to China now. So this is not really surprising. And I think instead of expecting, a complete cutoff of Chinese investment and economic ties, what we should have expected and expect now is more of a toning down in some of the more provocative moves. For instance, this government is likely or is unlikely to allow Chinese submarines to dock at its ports, which was something that made the Indians ballistic. So just in conclusion, I think there's a real opportunity with this new unity government to move forward with ethnic reconciliation, to unify the country following, nearly 3 decades of civil war, and the strong support from the U.S. and the positive changes in the U.S.-Sri Lankan relationship, I would argue, will help this goal. But admittedly, there's a window of opportunity here, and the government has to sort of get a move on with taking these steps to really take advantage of the current situation. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And finally, we'll hear from Alan Keenan.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone who organized this. And it's nice to meet some new faces to attach to names that I've read about for many years. Well, I've been given the task of laying out the obstacles to peace and reconciliation in Sri Lanka, so that certainly could take us a while. We have Crisis Group has a new paper coming out next week, which will discuss said obstacles in greater detail than I have in 8 minutes. I've also, though, been asked to sort of lay out possible ways around them, so that could definitely take another few days. But I'll give a very short, literally bullet points. I mean, some of these obstacles are obvious. I mean, there's obviously, to dealing with both justice and peace in Sri Lanka, Sinhala nationalism, its attachment to the unitary and Buddhist state, and sort of the deep tendency, cultural tendency to be afraid of foreign involvement. That's obviously a big issue. Tamil nationalism in some of its forms is also, I think, an issue. Often sort of, I think what we've seen recently is some moves in the name, especially around the proposals for constitutional reform, sort of falling back into sort of traditional tropes that perhaps are unrealistic in the current dynamic, and which can provoke further Sinhala nationalist reactions, and which I think there's ongoing serious issues between Tamils and Muslims that need a lot of work throughout Sri Lanka, but particularly in the north and the east, and that seem to be not really being focused on by too many people. Now, all of this comes out in those sets of issues are particularly clear in the discourse around the Constitution, and I think there we have there's a lot of things. First of all, the Constitution, the new Constitution they're planning on trying to put together the reforms will cover a range of issues, the executive presidency, a Bill of Rights, electoral reform, a new electoral system, and in addition, devolution of power. And the fear is that given the various other obstacles, the various competing nationalisms, but then the other ones I'm going to lay out, that the deal or what is offered on devolution will almost certainly be considerably short of what many Tamil organizations and the sort of traditional Tamil demands / aspirations for the self-determination of the Tamil nation. And so the question then is, where does that leave? What will the effects on the Tamil polity be if offered something pretty modest? What will the effects be on the TNA and on the internal Tamil dynamics? So that we still have to see how that plays out. Other obstacles, the big elephant in the room is the military and the national security state, which was very deeply entrenched further by the Rajapaksas after, of course, already having been quite powerful over the previous decades of war. We see active resistance to what are called confidence-building measures and demilitarization in the north, on also related issues like the release of detainees or political prisoners. And I think confidence building, because of that resistance, measures which are called confidence building measures have actually become confidence undermining measures, because I think the lack of progress has made those issues actually problems, points of friction more than they are points of lubrication. I think you also are clearly seeing quite active resistance to any kind of serious accountability, whether with regard to the very end of the war, or related issues about the way in which the counterinsurgency campaign was fought from under the Rajapaksas. So I'm thinking here about political killings of TNA MPs, murders and abductions of dissidents, including some Sinhalese dissidents, many of which are allegedly involved, were done by or with the involvement of military intelligence. So there's clearly resistance from the military and from the national security state, and there's trepidation from the civilian leadership about how to handle that, and fears about pushing too hard. I think there's also signs that the Rajapaksa loyalists run deep and are beyond just the Sri Lankan Freedom Party and the UPFA alliance, but also are in the military, are in the bureaucracy, and are in something that sometimes gets referred to as the deep state, the depth of and extension of which we are not quite sure about, but certainly something like that exists. You also have the obstacles that that are in the nature of the coalition government. So you have you have two parties which have hated each other and frequently committed violence towards each other in elections, now working together. You have deep divisions in the SLFP about that relationship. You have very different approaches and policies, and some of them rooted in ideology or sort of political traditions, but also in terms of style between the president and the prime minister. Prime minister known and frequently criticized for secrecy, for being arrogant, for controlling things very tightly, and a president who works quite differently. And you have the coalition built on the inclusion of ministers from the former government, many of them implicated in corruption or other, reportedly nefarious activities, which undermines their presence undermines the claims of the government to be a good governance oriented one. Then you also just have lack of technical capacity. You have a government having taken on an enormous agenda: economic reforms, new constitution, whole range of transitional justice initiatives, demilitarization, but not a lot of technical capacity, whether in terms of actual legal training or down to computers in the office or lawyers to handle the cases. And then you have, in part because of that, I think you have a whole set of overlapping and ad hoc initiatives that the government has created. Office of National Unity and Reconciliation. How does that relate to the Ministry of National Dialogue and the Ministry of Reconciliation? How do they relate to the Secretariat for Coordinating Reconciliation Mechanisms? How does that compare to the working group that's established under the Foreign Ministry? I mean, just an enormous mess in some sense, but So, and then finally you have, or two more final obstacles. You have the economic problems, which are considerable. And I think you have a dilemma, the government faces a dilemma. I think doing nothing is obviously not an option. If current trajectories continue, barring just, some very fortunate changes in the global economic context, you have doing nothing is not an option. The trends will undermine their support ultimately, I think. But the problem is, I think the standard liberal reforms they're proposing, or that they seem tempted by, and that the IMF is encouraging them, bring major risks of political instability, of resistance, of displeasure, economic pressure on particular groups, which will then be, I think we already see this, they're already being seized by the Rajapaksa faction, by the JVP, by a range of other actors, as is more generally the opening, sort of economic opening, perhaps either in the form of the free trade agreement or the ECTA agreement with India, or a free trade agreement with any number of other countries that are being considered. And finally, I think you have, just to touch on what's already been touched on, I think you have a tendency of Western governments, and I think in different ways India and Japan, to downplay justice and reconciliation issues so as not to, on the one hand, not to undermine, not to put undue pressure on a government which has all these enormous issues it has to deal with. I think for sometimes defensible reasons, there are real dilemmas involved in how fast you can go, in the potential interference between the different things on its agenda. But I think also that other reasons to downplay it are perhaps less defensible. They're more about geostrategic calculations, sort of the desire to support a government not necessarily because it's doing the right thing, but because it's not with China, and related issues along those lines. So So those are the obstacles. I haven't gotten to the answers, but you can read our report next week, or I'll try to sort of toss out some possible ways forward in the question and answer period. Thanks.
Thank you, Alan. I'd now just like to give each of our panelists a minute or two if they would like to respond to any of the perspectives shared by their fellow panelists. We can start with you.
I'm up top. Well, I'd like to thank my other panelists for their remarks. As usual, they were very thought-provoking. I agree with Alan on all the challenges. I mean, and that's just the start of it. I mean, there are so many in Sri Lanka. But part of what I don't agree on is what sometimes is suggested on the part of the United States, that this is all about China. It's really not all about China from the United States perspective. We have many different interests in Sri Lanka, not the least of which is humanitarian. And so I think, as we move forward, whether or not people believe it, those interests are many and varied, and I think it's reflected in the support we're trying to give Sri Lanka now.
Sudha?
I would agree with, China has kind of appeared as explanation for almost any kind of change. And if you look at Chinese involvement in Sri Lanka, it's long-standing. It's almost as long as the United States. And precisely what the Rajapaksa government was doing vis-a-vis China is not that different to what previous governments were doing, or indeed what this government is doing. And in terms of the Indian position, there's been a huge amount of sort of public press coverage and a lot of pronouncement on this issue. But for me, the 90% of Chinese investment in China went to Gujarat whilst Modi was was chief minister. And since becoming prime minister, he's reached out to China extensively. So I think the geopolitical frame tends to cut out a lot of complexity and reduce it to very simple sort of swings. But I think for me, the confidence building measures that Kara was speaking about, to put them in context, the North and East is militarized. And that doesn't mean, sort of a lot of soldiers running around. The scale is unprecedented. The North and East contains more troops than there are in the entire British military. Right? And the Sri Lankan military is larger than the militaries of France and Germany combined. That's the scale of militarization. So we're looking at confidence building measures. This is a situation post-war where there is a war footing, if you will. So it's very easy. There are lots of steps that Sri Lanka in the past has implemented, for example, during the peace process, quickly shutting down military presences, opening up access, allowing humanitarians in and so on. That has taken 7 years and is still being held out as sort of tiny, tiny steps. So I think in terms of the enthusiastic response from the U.S. administration, particularly in the last 6 months, to very, very tiny steps by the Sri Lankan government, has pretty much ended any pressure to move faster. That's my kind of take. Because why has the Sri Lankan government done what it's doing? Either it believes in liberal principles and liberal reform in and of themselves, or it's being pushed to do it. Right? And in my view, seeing as the United States has pretty much, and particularly from the comments taken from Samantha Powers the other day, the Sri Lankan government has done well. It's a pretty good achievement to bring the United States on board with very little in terms of concessions, and that's even before the list that Alan rolled out. So that's my take. My feeling is we've been here before. We were here in the 90s. We were here in the early 2000s, and I think we would have. My expectation is that things will turn out pretty much the same way.
Lisa?
Well, I think I already made my point, but I'll just restate it that, I think you have to look at this in context and look where we were just a couple of years ago. And you have to admit that this government has done some very positive things for the country in terms of restoring democracy, parliamentary democracy, even the kind of language that it uses in terms of encouraging ethnic reconciliation. And if we don't recognize when things are moving in the right direction, then I don't think there's any hope of continuing that and building on that. I'll just look at the issue of military engagement. One of the purposes of increasing the military engagement or getting that back on track is to begin to look at how Sri Lanka can have a peacetime military orientation. Because like you said, there's no need for the kind of militarization that we see in the North and East. So I think the U.S. Can help in terms of its engagement on these issues. That's my perspective.
And Alan?
Yeah, well, I mean, the way I'm following up on this developing exchange, I'd say, I mean, the way I think about it is there's clearly been initial opening, even the mantra that Kara said she heard, which I heard a version of, the idea that you get from people in the North and the East and elsewhere, that sort of nothing is, yes, lots has changed, but nothing has changed. I think the way I interpret that is, yes, there's openings, right? Yes, we can speak now. Yes, we can complain, but we're complaining about all the things that haven't changed because nothing other than our right to complain really somewhat more safely has changed. Now, I would say a little bit more has changed than that, but I think that is the fundamental issue. I mean, the fundamental difference is that there is a whole set of new freedoms. Great. But the question is, can they be institutionalized? Right now, they are about they're sort of more like granted from the powers that be. It's, the same institutions are still there, which formerly were actively used by the Rajapaksas and in different ways previous regimes to repress dissent, to harass on the basis of ethnicity or politics. Those are not being used. But when you actually look at the institutional changes so far, they've been fairly minimal. So that's the key. And I think there's an intention by some in the government to try to institutionalize them. And to the extent that the outside forces, whether they're, intellectuals, NGOs, foreign governments, can help them to institutionalize them, I think that's the key goal. But I think it's very open. It's a very open question about how far they will be and what the degrees of political will, given in part some of the obstacles, the sort of political dynamics I laid out. And I would agree with Sudha that I think the rhetoric of the U.S. government and other governments, but principally the U.S., has been a bit over the top, particularly lately. It's been a bit too enthusiastic, and I think that does clearly, I mean, people I talk to, even reform elements within the government, are clearly reforming to some degree because they were under pressure. So I think it's logical that the pressure has to be done skillfully, but the less pressure, the less reform there will be. I think that's just sort of almost a mechanical relationship. It doesn't answer the tricky question, which is how to pressure in a politically savvy way. But I think without pressure, there will not be change. And that's been told to me by people inside the Sri Lankan government.
Thank you. I'd like to lead with a couple of questions before we turn to our attendees to also hear from you. First off, certainly a lot of our discussion has focused on the U.S. government's optimism as demonstrated by statements by various senior officials and also many of its actions. Given these very critical statements we've heard most recently from the two UN special rapporteurs who just concluded their visits and also the recent spate of abductions in the Northeast, what are the implications of Ambassador Power's statement that Sri Lanka is a global champion of human rights?
Well, I agree with what Alan said, that perhaps those were comments that were a little very much forward-leaning. Sri Lanka obviously is a very, very mixed picture right now. There are openings that the United States welcomes, but there is a lot left to do. As I said, I think the fact that the rapporteurs got into Sri Lanka and were given unprecedented access and were able to state these findings is huge, and it's a very welcome sign. Now, that doesn't take away from all the other things the Sri Lankan government needs to do, but just counterbalancing both their comments and Ambassador Power's comments, I think That would be my response.
Yeah, I mean, the brief of the special rapporteurs was to focus on specific kinds of human rights abuses, and what they're saying is that these abuses are continuing. They're saying they're probably not as sort of brazen or flagrant as they were under the Rajapaksa administration, but they are continuing. And as Ellen said, the infrastructure of repression that sustained that under Rajapaksa is still very much in place. So we're looking at intelligence, we're looking at torture, we're looking at the Prevention of Terrorism Act, which allows confessions extracted under torture to be used for prosecution. So all of that is in place. Now, all of that was central to how the U.S. engaged with Sri Lanka as criteria for reform. And we have seen senior Sri Lankan officials roll back on their commitments on those issues. So it's not surprising these are continuing. So the question is, a year or two from now, do we expect human rights abuses to be less or more, right, under these circumstances? So can we expect abductions and torture and so on to continue next year and the year after and the year after? And if not, why not? And to me, that's the key aspect of the accountability thing. The accountability thing has been kind of bundled up into this one or more policy issue area. But the heart of the question here is the legacy of the war is the Sri Lankan armed forces. And there were war crimes on both sides. But core to this process is that the Sri Lankan state and its armed forces are accused of killing large numbers of Sri Lankan citizens. Now, that's been pushed aside as not very important. And to me, if those can't be punished, then the possibility of liberal reform stands on very shaky ground. And I don't recall accountability being stressed the same way this year as it was last year. And if I can say it, then I presume the policymakers in Sri Lankan, in Colombo, who see it will say, well, these are what we should focus on, because that's what the US talks about. That's what the EU talks about. That's what Britain talks about. And that's, in terms of engagement, one person has to lead the dance, and liberal states are dropping key issues, which I think will lead to a return to these problems in a year or two. That's the implications of ambassadors.
I just wanted to follow up a bit on my own remarks. I mean, I do think that, I mean, if we just took Ambassador Power remarks at face value, yes, they're very over the top. My hope is that the government, our government is working harder to hold the Sri Lankan government to account. I mean, there have to be, in all of the excitement and enthusiasm that we've put forward, like I said, we have to deliver, and we have to expect them to deliver as well. And so this is where, I found those comments a little disheartening going forward, because there has to be some expectation on our part regarding how much left there is to do.
Lisa?
Well, yeah, I agree that statement by Samantha Power was not in tune with the ground realities in Sri Lanka, and it's a little jarring, and one would hope there would be more diplomatic nuance in U.S. statements than was found in that particular statement. But, with that, I would say, well, certainly we expect that human rights abuses are going to decline over the next year, and if they don't, then there should be some resulting consequence in terms of the U.S.-Sri Lankan relationship. I mean, that's the whole idea of, there have been some openings in Sri Lanka, so the U.S. matches that with some of its own openings and goes from there. And I would point out, I was struck when, right after the January 2015 election that brought Sirisena to power, and I met with some U.S. government folks shortly thereafter, and I felt they were very slow to recognize the monumental change that had come in the politics of Sri Lanka. And there was a real reluctance to accept that there had been this fundamental change in the politics, and a lot of skepticism, I would say. Now, I think when you had the unity government form after the election, the parliamentary elections in August, then there was sort of, okay, this is for real. This represents a real change and does show commitment by the new leadership to make changes in the country. And then you started seeing things happen. Now, one could make the argument that maybe the U.S. course corrected, and that's how this statement from Samantha Power has come out, and maybe there is a need to match its statements more with the realities on the ground. I certainly, would agree with that.
And Ellen?
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree very much with Sudha's perspective here on this one. I mean, in the sense that I think one of the messages of I think it's been a message in our previous reporting, but certainly in our next report, is that questions of impunity and accountability understood broadly, and, about the sort of the rule of law in its deepest sense, about making sure that all citizens are equally protected from abuses, and that abuses, which I think in order for that to be meaningful, it requires some degree of backward-looking justice. I think until that happens, everything is fragile. And that now, for that to happen, I think it has to happen in a strategic way. And I think part of the problem was, one of the problems, I think, is we got into a conversation in December, January, February, March that was very focused on the probably the most difficult issue, the role of foreign judges in trying the Sri Lankan military. That was, in some sense, the issue you want to deal with at the very end of a process. Now, it's understandable why it's also the one people are concerned with and talk about first, but I think we need to think about ways of starting with the easier steps on justice, sort of starting with some institutional reforms, starting with prosecutions of the easier cases, prosecutions of corruption, which have only sort of barely begun, and still no serious indictments. Sort of to build up, to give people a sense, the broader public a sense that something new is really there, that it's not just sort of talk, but there's actually action, and to build up the strength of the prosecutors, the emboldened police, that actually, if they prosecute people, they're not going to be fired or transferred to Nowheresville. So I think if we take things step by step now, and if the government frames the accountability agenda. Accountability, a word principally understood and associated with what happened in the war, issues of the North and the East, issues of Tamils. If that can be framed as actually part of an agenda that addresses the issues of all Sri Lankans, because of course it isn't only Tamils, although they've been the principal sufferers of abusive governments, also Sinhalese have in their ways, certainly in the previous decades, suffered tremendously from an abusive state. So I think there's, at least in principle, an ability, if the government, I think that's the way at least to try, that the government to sell this agenda as an agenda for all citizens. But I think here, one last point, I think the tricky thing, and this comes now back to at the international level, one of the challenges is that a lot of people believe, and I think there's reason to believe, that as of March 2017, when the High Commission of Human Rights reports to the UN Human Rights Council on progress in implementing the resolution from last October 1st, a lot of people believe at that point the pressure disappears, the international pressure disappears in any significant sense. Yes, you could still have maybe some special rapporteurs visiting. Yes, you might have some, the potential for foreign governments to criticize in, lack of reforms, et cetera. But that, I think, unless the Human Rights Council process can be continued somehow, which most people think is politically unrealistic, or some other alternative happens to keep sort of the government's feet to the fire, and at least long enough that some kind of domestic sort of process with domestic buy-in and its own momentum has picked up, then I think there's great reason to doubt. So I mean, that's the conundrum. I don't have the answer, but that's the conundrum I've been struggling with. We do have this clock ticking, and we don't yet have internal, sort of the domestic political forces strong enough that are in support of this process, or a process itself having developed enough momentum within Sri Lanka to carry on without international pressure. So that's the question. I don't have the answer.
My second question for all of the panelists is, Can there be a political solution without accountability? And if not, why is the current conversation around constitutional reform and an accountability mechanism seemingly so dialectical? We can start with Kara.
Always up top.
Mhm.
Both of those are very difficult issues, and they're definitely related. I mean, I think there has to be some level of accountability for there to be peace and a durable peace within Sri Lanka. But you know, the hard reality is there's only so much bandwidth in any country, within any institution, and while definitely both need to move forward, I do believe that constitutional reform is absolutely necessary as a first step. I don't want to downplay accountability. That has to happen, but it's a much longer process. And I think if political reform or a political solution can be reached that would satisfy most, if not all, Sri Lankans, would go a long way towards at least creating some level of optimism within Sri Lanka for the long haul, which will be accountability, institutional reform, all of that.
Sudha?
Yeah, I mean, the way accountability and a political solution have been discussed, I mean, certainly in recent years, is one or the other, right? And for me, they come together in the character of the state. A constitution represents a particular kind of state. So constitutional reform means the change in the current state towards a different kind of state. This is an assumption people actually respect the constitution. And given the rule of law's problems in Sri Lanka, particularly around accountability, for me, the two are linked together. If you can't prosecute mass atrocities, then changing the constitution is neither here nor there. I mean, I agree. I mean, people have made the argument that if you have sweeping reform and a political solution that satisfies Tamil political aspirations, the demand for accountability will decline. I'm not convinced that's the case because the two are linked. Because this is what the state did to the Tamils because they're Tamils. That's how it's understood. Now, why are we suddenly talking about political solution this year? I mean, it's a puzzle. Given it's a fragile situation, everyone agrees. To me, it's the same reason we have discussed a political solution. Sri Lanka has discussed a political solution in the late 90s and before, and Rajapaksa himself was discussing a political solution during the first stage of his management of the war. It distracts international attention. The clock is ticking, as Alan says. Right? Instead of focusing on accountability, we dangled this idea of political progress towards a solution. Chandrika Kumaratunga did it with the package, the devolution package, the much celebrated devolution package, which, by the way, was far more extensive than what's proposed now. So, to me, this distracts international, and this is where the optimism is unhelpful because people say, oh, they're doing the right thing, let's back them, even though they're almost impossible to deliver. I don't believe that this particular constitutional process will work because the Sri Lankan government has not told its public, and I mean the singular public, why there needs to be a solution. That it has simply not been sold. Neither is accountability. Even if they say, look, the international community, the United Nations have conducted investigation, let's investigate, let's prosecute, and if these people are not responsible, we'll let them go. That's not what they say. What they actually say is there were no war crimes. And I was doing some reading over the weekend, and I came across a forgotten quote from President Sirisena when he was health minister, when the U.S. first started pushing accountability. And what he said is the U.S. is doing this, pushing human rights at the UN Human Rights Council because they're trying to divide the country by presenting false allegations against us. But patriotic Sri Lankans will never allow that to happen. The capitalist countries, including the U.S., are using various means to destroy the peaceful environment, i.e. the post-war environment, and stifle the progress of Asian countries. The U.S. presents these allegations to please terrorist agents in certain Western countries. This is President Sirisena. That's his view of accountability. He doesn't believe in what I suggested, which is that states' armed forces kill the state citizens in large numbers and something has to be done. That's why I find it difficult to take seriously the constitutional process. But it is what it is.
Lisa?
Yeah, okay, so I think that certainly this government has been less triumphalist in its statements, the way it talks about the issue and the war, but certainly has to go further in terms of enforcing accountability. And to answer the basic question, can there be a political solution without accountability? And I said probably not. But this is for the Tamils to decide, right? Because they're the victims. So I think that only the Tamil community can answer that question. Now, I find it interesting, this idea that talking about a political solution, are they putting the cart before the horse? Is this all a distraction? I can't really answer that right now. But what I will say is, I don't think that was the case in 2002. I'm not so cynical that I think that, when Prime Minister Wickremesinghe was in power previously, that, this was all just a facade and there was no real effort to, try to move forward with a kind of peace process. And I think you have to look at the different leaders and what their motivations are. Anytime you are talking about a political solution or a peace process, I think we have to acknowledge that different leaders might have different views. Wickremesinghe probably has much different views than the president, Sirisena, on this. And I would just note that when the foreign minister was here, Samar Wira, when he spoke about the accountability process and whether there would be international involvement, he left that door open a lot wider than we've seen from President Sirisena. So I would just note that there are probably differences within the government itself on these issues. So we can't really paint it black and white.
Yeah, no, just to clarify, my contrast was drawn with the devolution package, which Chandrika Kumaratunga launched in the late 90s, so 97, 98, which at the time when she was launching a broad front assault on Jaffna and so on and so forth, helped mitigate international criticism of the excesses. Whereas the Norwegian-led peace process, which was probably a more substantive international intervention, started with the premise we need to be deeply involved to drive it through. It can't be left to them to sort it out amongst themselves. And in fact, Prime Minister Wickremesinghe's international credentials were built during the peace process because he said the right things. He backed federalism, he backed a negotiated solution, he accepted that we need to have a political solution to move forward. But since then, he's backtracked from those very principles, where he talks in more abstract terms about inclusivity. But inclusivity and hierarchy are not exclusive in the way he's been framed. His last comments in January said, I'm Sinhalese, I'm a Buddhist, and I'm not going to allow Buddhism to be diluted. It's a public statement, just as a constitutional process starts. To me, why I'm skeptical about the constitutional changes, if you want to change the Sri Lankan constitution, you need to have a 2/3 majority in parliament and then win a referendum. It has to be approved by referendum. There's no way the Sri Lankan public will approve anything that looks like a concession to Tamils, which is pretty much any form of power sharing. That's the reason for my skepticism. It's not being discussed as a national crisis.
Yes. No, I think one of the main messages of our report coming out is precisely that the government, if it wants to do what it says it wants to do, it needs to start selling its policies much more clearly to the whole public in different ways, but principally to Sinhalese, whether it's on devolution/power sharing, whether it's on accountability, or more broadly transitional justice. And I think it is quite worrisome that it hasn't been. And I think one theory is that there is a desire to sort of so there's two ways of reading that. One is they're not serious about either of these processes. The other is that, yes, they want to sort of slip these things in quietly, or maybe a slightly more optimistic version. They want to sort of build them in slowly. But I think that's a defensible. I mean, it can't simply be dismissed. So I would disagree maybe with Sudha there. But it's a risky strategy, and there's certainly no guarantees. And I would I think at some point, Sirisena and Vikramasinghe, but principally Sirisena, who has much better credentials as a Sinhala Buddhist from the heartland kind of politician, I think he's really got to start selling both at least the idea. So, I mean, of power sharing, of devolution, of strengthening provincial powers, particularly in the North and East. Now, what he said he said very generically, we need to have a solution, right? We can't have another war. We've got to address these issues, right? All that's good, and it's not what Mahinda Rajapaksa was saying. But he's not even gone from sort of the general to the somewhat less general, much less to the specific. So now the constitutional process, hopefully, when the deals begin to emerge and some kind of clarity emerges about what the president, the prime minister, Chandrika Kumaratunga, who's also involved in this process, TNA leaders think they can get through the parliament. Hopefully that will be stronger rather than weaker, but I think the indications are it will be pretty modest. But when that sort of deal begins to crystallize, they've got to start selling it. And similarly, they've got to start selling at least the idea of transitional justice. If not, trying troops next month, then at least, yes, there are real issues here we have to deal with. Yes, there were atrocities. Yes, there is suffering on all sides. Yes, the institutions need to be reformed. And if we want to prevent future wars, if we want to really address these issues, we've got to make real changes. And that, other than from Mangala Samaravira, who's articulate, smart, and I think probably pretty genuinely interested in and committed to this himself, but he's the foreign minister. He's not the one making the decisions. He's the one giving the speeches. So glad we have him. Glad Sri Lanka has him, but he's not enough. And I think others have to step up a bit more to start sort of changing the dynamics.
Thank you, all of you. I'd like to now open up the discussion to our attendees. We have about 15 minutes to do some Q&A with the panelists. I will just strongly request that everyone limit their remarks to a question for one or more of the panelists. I know we all have very strong views on these issues, and we'll have time during the reception to engage in a longer discussion with all of our panelists. Question in the front. If you could just introduce yourself and your affiliation as well.
So I suspect that this question is for Alan, and so we get an opportunity to talk more about solutions to the problems and how the leadership might go about making difficult sells to be somehow Buddhist public. So justice for atrocity crimes in deeply divided societies is phenomenally challenging because robust mechanisms require public buy-in. And especially in democracy, a government that attempts to push through transitional justice without that public buy-in is going to risk getting chucked out of office or worse. So this government hasn't delivered on commitments that it made 7 months ago to the UN Human Rights Council. And in that time, we've seen evidence that their support among their primary constituency is slipping. We've also seen alarming indications that the deep state, as it's called, continues to be very powerful. So given those facts, is it actually reasonable for us to expect this government to push on transitional justice, on accountability for mass atrocities, even if additional international pressure is supplied, would they be risking their political future in a way that just isn't reasonable to anticipate?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the political science perspective is, is important to think through, and you may well be right. So I don't have, but I think, if we could wind the clock back to September or October 2nd, I think if the government had moved more quickly on the easier things, on the consultations, on the setting up, and on the basis of those setting up the missing persons office, reparations policy, if they had pushed a bit harder then on land, on returning more land, on returning it with a package of that made it more easy for people to actually move in and set up homes again, if they had released more detainees, if they had moved then, I think you might have begun to get a sort of positive synergies and a positive sort of a virtuous circle. And yes, you would have gotten resistance, from Mahinda and his people, which is a lot of people potentially. But I think you might have gotten something going. Now in May, I think you still need to do all those things, but whether whether they can do it fast enough, I don't know. Now, I do think the way to, what I was saying, which sometimes I think sounds a bit naive in Sri Lanka, and certainly may sound naive in an audience or, among Tamils outside of Sri Lanka, and in sort of this idea of framing issues of justice and sort of institutional reform as broadly as possible so that it can appeal to Sinhalese as well. I mean, that is, and the naive version is one in which it ignores or denies the Sinhala sort of nature of the state. But I think, even taking that into account, I think that is the way to go. It's the only way to go. Whether it will work, I don't know. But if that's not the way these things are framed, way sort of the transitional justice and accountability agenda is brought in, then it's not going to succeed, right? Whether bringing it in this broader framework does succeed, still maybe not. But
Take the next question. Yes, and if you could just identify your name and affiliation.
My name is Anandaraj Potambula. I was taken up by the point Alan Keenan made that the elephant on the table, the elephant in the room is political. Right? And actually, the other side of the coin is the victims and their loved ones who were at the receiving end of this elephant. There were tens of thousands of innocent civilians who were massacred, killed. That should be the focus of this. I can understand that changes and so on for the better, but the fact remains that I was there in 2002, 2006, the 5 years of the ceasefire. There were 450,000 or more civilians who were by census numbers in the rebel areas. Those are the 250,000 people with whom I worked for 5 years. And government, military and government have admitted that only 300,000 people were finally released from the internment camps after the war. What happened to the 150,000? That is the key. Those 150,000 people, there were stragglers, there were a couple of thousand LTT fighters, rebels, but the remainder, 150,000 people, civilians, were unaccounted. That should be the focus of all. They are easy to avoid. All these highfalutin, convoluted discussions about the finer points of what's happening today and what didn't happen yesterday and so on. And if that government cannot even accept the fact that it can say sorry to these people who have lost their loved ones, who are suffering, then you cannot have any semblance of closure. Right? Not a slight semblance of closure where the government can say that, okay, this may have happened. They totally deny it. I lived with this for 4 or 5 years. We had schools there, we had civilian administration in place, and we had a nation that was going on in that ceasefire period. The whole thing broke down in the ceasefire, broke down because of the attack that put out the rebels as terrorists. They were fighters, no doubt. There was tremendous human rights abuses and so on by the LTT themselves. Before I don't know what happened before the ceasefire, because I came back at the time of the war. The older generation left and came back. We only went back with the ceasefire. So, but my point is that we are leaving this elephant on the table and nothing. The elephant that is the dead most of the table is the sad state of the 150,000 people, innocent civilians, massacred, and their loved ones were still suffering. That is
Is there a specific question that you would like to ask of the panelists, or does anyone want to respond to that?
I mean,
Please.
it's a familiar. It's a familiar perspective, right? That this 150,000 or whatever the number is not important. It's the fabric of northeastern society. It's been ripped up, and several years after the war, yes, the Rajapaksa government maintained a system of military repression and surveillance and so on, and it's been pulled in. The teeth have been pulled in, but it's in place. So although there is more complaining, for a lot of people, the constitutional tweaking, constitutional fiddling is neither here nor there, because it's felt in a very visceral and day-to-day experience of that's where those shells fell, or that's where we were running, and so on. So accountability is not just a legal thing. It's a kind of it's a way of being. And for me, the framing, and I think the framing that would, you would probably have found it in the North and East. People understand this was done to us, and nothing seems to be possible. And that the idea of a social contract, political science argument between the Tamil people and the Sri Lankan state is built around a particular way of organizing repression, which is why the militarization is important. It's the same troops on patrol, the same troops in those camps who were responsible for this. So, and this is years and years and years. So, progress is, the confidence building measures works at a very visceral level, not just in terms of metrics and statistics and so on. That's
Thank you. Yes, a question in the back. If you could just introduce yourself and your affiliation, please.
I apologize, I wasn't here for most of the presentation, but this is a subject matter that we are familiar with and reported on for several years. Given that the political reconciliation is going to be very painful and will not be immediate, what can civil society organizations, based primarily here in America, offer to the Sri Lankan people to assist in this reconciliation process, and whether it be to the Tamils directly, to the Sinhalese directly, or to really bring them both at a neighborly level together? Because I feel that will reverberate up to the leadership if they can just begin to be neighbors once again. But this might be my naive point. I've never been sure. Any insight into that would be helpful for us from wanting pieces.
Right. I have a couple thoughts. I wholeheartedly agree that one of the biggest challenges is going to be for this government to convince all of Sri Lanka to move in the same direction. The president and the prime minister have made very conflicting remarks, but at some point, for this all to be possible and for things to improve remarkably, that is the first thing that has to happen. So I think civil society can go a long way in that direction. One of the things that at least I found when I visited Sri Lanka one of the other times was concerning to me was the polarization of civil society within Sri Lanka. I think civil society during the Rajapaksa era was, we just got to get rid of these people. This just isn't a good thing. But now that they've gotten rid of them and we've got this new coalition government, we've got some in civil society who think that's just enough. Let's, fix, the corruption and get the economy back on track, and all of that's good. But then there's a whole other side of civil society that's very suspect of what's going to happen, and in some ways for very good reason. And so I think too, for civil society that's not on those polar ends of this discussion, I think it would be useful to try to bring people together where they can and have civil society working together more, and try to avoid some of the polarization you see now, because they were very helpful in the run-up to 2015. And I think to have them divided, as I believe they are now, is not good for Sri Lanka. So those are just two thoughts from me.
Would anyone else like to respond to that question?
Well, I do. I endorse what Kara was saying. Clearly there have been significant changes within, I would call it sort of organized, politically active civil society, because, of course, civil society is a huge category that includes monks and business leaders and so forth. But sort of the organized, the NGO world, the activist world was united pretty much against Rajapaksa, and now is divided on multiple fronts, and that's not productive. But I think it's in part an effect of the slow progress, particularly the slow progress on demilitarization and changes in the north, so that while not only about ethnic divisions and regional divisions, a lot of the divisions that Kara sees and that I see are on those lines. It's also partly the feeling that people in Colombo are closer to power, and people outside of Colombo are away from it, which is both a practical problem. It affects power, but it also is a psychological issue. It's like you might think the guys in Colombo actually have more power than they might. But there are those issues, and they're quite significant. I think what the answer is. In terms of your original question, I'm a bit of a skeptic, having been in Sri Lanka for a lot of the peace process, having studied sort of civil society as an agent of peace building in Sri Lanka. I'm a bit skeptical about its power to make real change at the grassroots if the state is not on board, right? So the state is still the determining factor. And we saw that, and the state, or during the peace process, the state and non-state agents that were claiming the status of a state, i.e. the LTTE, if those guys don't want peace to be, there won't be peace. If they don't want reconciliation, there won't be. And so, yes, I think civil society, grassroots, cross-ethnic, cross-religious, cross-regional, sort of trust building processes, institution building is important, but it's only going to get as far as the state allows it to get. So,
yes, Siva.
I would agree with what Kara said and what Alan also. I mean, civil society in Sri Lanka is a dangerous business. I mean, it always has been, but particularly when you're talking about issues of accountability, or when you're talking about let alone self-determination and so on. It's a dangerous business. And during the peace process, which arguably was a period of almost naive optimism that finally things are going to be different, there was an explosion in civil society activity in all kinds of levels. And as the ceasefire broke down, hundreds of civil society activists were picked up and disappeared. I mean, it's almost a mini politicide within the broader this thing. So I think that has a lasting legacy. I mean, although a number of people are very vocal, they're very active, and so on, I think a large number of people who would be politically active, particularly in the post-war era, are nervous, right? Because the state is still there. And this is why it goes back to questions about militarization and surveillance and so on, is that a lot of people who would otherwise be politically active are going to keep quiet. Right, so there are multiple aspects of it. So civil society, like media, it's not a question of whether you're picked up today. It's a question of things cannot be assured for the next year and the following year. You might disappear then for what you said today. Right, and that's the stifling aspect of the present. So, yeah, hence my question about next year, the following year.
Thank you. One last question.
Provide trauma counseling for folks who've been affected by the war, South also back in Sri Lanka. My question is for anybody in the panel, really, taking the perspective of really long view. 2005 was the 500th anniversary of Portuguese wisdom in Sri Lanka, colonizing the country. Since independence, we've been accustomed to think of Sri Lanka as a unified state. Even though the Tamils, Muslims, Sinhalese, simple country Sinhalese. But at the time that the Portuguese came, there were 7 different kingdoms, and they were always in a state of flux. And it took 450 years before they were ruled by 4 different powers to unify the country. It wasn't a country unified by itself, by one unit. So 2 questions. One, what's your perspective in terms of what the current government is doing to enact a nation building and unification process? And then second, looking through history, where it's not the first time it's taking place in the world in the post-colonial era, are there other success stories in countries that have been able to achieve that type of unification, true unification, not just one group that won, everything was fine and everybody falls into line?
Well, those are huge issues. I don't know. I mean, the whole idea of unification might not be the term that I would use, but certainly bringing together in productive and peaceful ways. I think I don't know. I don't have any good answer to it, but I think certainly there's a different vision of which would sort of be about rediscovering the seven kingdoms, or the plurality, and figuring out fluid relationships between them, so that you were Sri Lankan, but you could also be these other things, and those two things were not at odds or at war with each other. That would be my sort of approach. Whether globally this is something that the whole world is struggling with all over. I don't think there's any quick answers.
Yeah, I mean, what you're looking at is whether you can have a united state with a multi-nation community, right? And as you say, it's colonial, a series of colonial occupations that produced a certain Ceylon and a certain. But I would look at the UK, right, which is the United Kingdom of England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. It's 4 nations, and routinely we talk of 4 countries and 4 capitals. So it's possible to think about your society in ways that are not hierarchical. And I was saying in conversation yesterday, the Scots in the UK are 8%, right, of the population. No one, unless they're very brave, will refer to them as a minority. Right? They're just one of the 4 peoples. Now, so the question of nation and minority are hugely consequential for how one thinks of other people and how people think of themselves. And this is at the heart of the Sri Lankan problem, the problem in Sri Lanka. Right? So even when you talk about the Sri Lankan people, there is a British people, but there's also an English people, and a Scottish people, and a Northern Irish people. A Northern Irish people, there
and
are
the Welsh
Catholic people, and the Welsh, and the Welsh. See, it's very easy. So what I'm saying is that these are ways that societies figure things out. The United Kingdom, which is a permanent member of the Security Council, had a referendum last year on whether Scotland, with the nuclear bases, should secede. Right? No one freaked out. No one went to war. No one got abducted. Right? And it was a consequential election, and we might have it again if we leave Europe. So what I'm saying is that societies have ways of dealing with big questions without going into crisis. The problem in Sri Lanka is you can't have that conversation. I mean, it's outlawed. It's the 6th Amendment. As much as there are useful amendments, that's a very important one, because the central question of what is Ceylon, what is Sri Lanka, who are the Sri Lankans, cannot be debated in a free and fair way. Right? Because read the 6th Constitution. Plus, I'm going on a bit. The Constitution is being reformed or being discussed. Chapter 2 of the Sri Lankan Constitution says, and I quote, "It is the duty of the state to protect and foster Buddhism." Right? If that's not up for debate and up for revision or exclusion, then this is not a process that's going to lead to any kind of lasting solution, in my view, because it's the identity of the state.
I think we could sit here for several more hours and continue this discussion, as I'm sure many of us would love to, but I've already taken us over time. So now I would just like to ask each of our panelists to just take a minute to share some closing remarks. And if you haven't already, if you would share some policy prescriptions for the United States at this time, we'd love to hear those. We can start with Alan.
That's great, because I had 2 thoughts that were that I wanted, 2 recommendations, 2 simple ones, I think, to the U.S. and to other governments. And it's actually not directly in our report for next week, so it's good to have a chance to say it. I think I was hearing similar things to what Sudha was saying among some human rights defenders I know in the North, who were worried, and I'm thinking one in particular, but I think the worries are shared, who said, people came up for air during the peace process, protested. Now, many of them protested in favor of or along the lines of the policies of the LTTE. We don't have that issue now, but nonetheless, he said these people were gunned down, they were abducted, they were murdered, right, in large numbers. So, yes, things are okay now, but what happens when things break down? Who's going to defend me? So my point would be, my recommendation would be just to keep that in mind. All the governments in the world who are praising the current opening, which is there and needs to be seized, need to keep in mind the fragility of it and need to keep their commitments over the long term, both to prevent a backsliding, but also, if that happens, to actually do what they can to defend those who are speaking up now. And along those, sort of in parallel to that, I think for governments, including the United States, who are keen to engage with the Sri Lankan military. I think that's defensible if it is done in a clear-eyed way and with the principle, or at least one principal goal, the transformation of that military into ways in which it can accept accountability as a necessary process of its own cleansing, and in which it's about a process where it's downsized and where the civilian leadership has clear control, where it gives up its what I think is already, it gives up its now sort of worrying degree of autonomy vis-a-vis the political powers. So I think that's got to be, any engagement with the military has to have that as one of its primary focuses. Otherwise, it's merely either I think it's part of the problem if it doesn't have that framework.
Lisa?
Yeah, in terms of what the U.S. can do, certainly we can offer technical support to help the Sri Lankans implement an accountability or restorative justice process. I'm sure we're seeking to do that already, but I think we could be doing that even more so. So I think that's really important. As we can debate whether or not there's the political will or commitment to that, but I think the only way we really know that is if the U.S. engages on these issues and puts forward its suggestions. And if the government balks, then we know the political will is not there. So I think, very concrete ways that U.S. can assist in this process and should be getting involved. And, again, I'll just reiterate, now that we, have lifted some of the restrictions on military engaging with the military, that allows us also to be able to engage on issues of demilitarization and having a peacetime military. And I would just end by, I think we should think about if we were here 2 years ago having this conversation, it would be a much different discussion. So I grant that there are a lot of obstacles, and we can start to question the government's political will. We can talk about the U.S. Perhaps making statements that aren't in tune with the exact situation in Sri Lanka. But I also think we should remember where we were 2 years ago and how far the situation has come.
So your closing remarks?
Yeah, I think whether the United States thinks of itself as engaged in Sri Lanka or not, it is engaged. It always is, because that's just the way Sri Lanka's location in the world, that's a political, economic, and social space, is connected. So even during the Rajapaksa era, it is the United States leadership or the UN Human Rights Council that produced the kind of international mobilization that led to change. The problem is not whether the U.S. engages or not. The U.S. has to engage. The problem is whether it recognizes when things are not working and calibrates its engagement to that extent. The problem today is not that there's a tension in Washington. The problem is that the tension is enthusiastic, where it's not connected to what's going on the ground. So I would call for a constantly reevaluated engagement, where there is no concern with pulling back and taking a tougher stance. And just to add to that, I'm not convinced at all by the argument that the U.S. will lose Sri Lanka to China. Because Sri Lankan society, Sri Lanka's economy, Sri Lanka's place in the world is inextricably linked to the West. There's absolutely no one in Sri Lanka, no middle-class family is going to send their kids to a university in China or a university in Britain or the United States. Right? We play cricket. It's westernized. So I think it's been sort of a bogey that's been raised to temper U.S. criticism. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. Kara, your closing remarks.
I want to thank Lisa on her perspective about what the picture looked like 2 years ago. I think we do have to keep that in mind. But that said, my few remarks now, I just want to focus on the urgency of things that have got to get done. When this new government came in, everyone was very excited, happy, but There was also, not only on the part of U.S. officials, but also on the part of Sri Lankan officials, that this is a fragile government, and it only has so much time to make meaningful change be felt within Sri Lanka. Some people were throwing years out. They've got 2 years, they've got 5 years, but they don't have forever. And so I think in terms of U.S. policy, we have thrown out big ideas. We've been involved in large initiatives, but I also think we have to watch the clock a bit and work towards some very concrete, tangible results, in the immediate, in order to keep Sri Lankans on side. And I think that has to do with engagement with the leadership, working with the president and the prime minister to develop a consistent message that brings along all parts of Sri Lanka on this journey to create a durable peace. And then I go back to confidence building measures. We've got to push harder on making things happen that people feel on the ground. And so those were my thoughts.
Thank you. At the start of the event, we mentioned the upcoming June UNHRC session, at which we will hear an oral update from the High Commissioner for Human Rights on Sri Lanka's implementation, or lack thereof, to use the High Commissioner's words, of the resolution. And so certainly we all eagerly await that oral update. Also on everyone's minds, of course, is the upcoming anniversary of the end of the armed conflict in Sri Lanka, following the final stages in which tens of thousands of Tamil lives were lost in brutal government attacks. While Tamils around the world remember May 18th, we also want to express our solidarity with Tamils in the Northeast who are prohibited by the Sri Lankan government from publicly remembering their dead. I'd like to take the opportunity right now just to thank all of our panelists for joining us today to participate in this very important and ongoing discussion about these issues, and also to thank our attendees for all of your involvement in this work that's being done. I ask you to please stay for our reception, where you'll have more time to mingle with each other and the panelists. And finally, thank you, of course, to our very gracious hosts here today at Sidley Austin.